The Waitmata doesn't forgive. That's what my father told me when I was 7 years old, standing on the shore at Devonport watching the harbor swallow a fishing boat whole. The water came in fast that morning, gray and indifferent, and the boat was just gone. No argument, no second chance, just gone. I thought about that lesson the morning my grandson Theo pressed a folded piece of paper into my palm and whispered, "Grandpa, read this when you're alone. Don't let Mum see." I was 68 years old. I had survived 40 years in the building trade, 2 knee replacements, a divorce that nearly finished me, and the particular loneliness of a man who outlives the version of himself he was proudest of. I thought the hard part was behind me. I thought moving in with my daughter Carolyn in her house in Titirangi was the beginning of a quieter chapter, a gentler tide. I did not yet understand that some tides come from inside the house. My name is Gerald Firth. I spent most of my working life in Auckland, building other people's homes, which I always found a strange kind of irony. The houses I built still stand in Remuera, in Hurna Bay, in the good streets of Ponsonby where the villas sell for things that would have seemed like fiction when I was swinging a hammer. My own house, the one I shared with my wife Sandra for 31 years before she passed, was a modest weatherboard in Blockhouse Bay. Nothing fancy. Sandra always said the fancy ones made her nervous. She didn't trust a house that was trying too hard to impress you. Sandra died 3 years ago. Bowel cancer, fast and brutal, the way those things go when they decide they're going. After she died, I kept the house for 18 months, but I was rattling around in it like a marble in a tin. Too many rooms, too many mornings of making 2 cups of tea by habit, and then standing there holding one of them, feeling ridiculous. Carolyn had been asking me to move closer for years. She lives in Titirangi with her husband Dale Pemberton and their 2 kids Theo, who was 11 at the time, and his younger sister Pippa, who was 8. Big property up in the Waitakere Ranges, native bush on 3 sides. One of those houses with the kind of silence that either settles you or unnerves you depending on what you're carrying. When Carolyn suggested I move into the self-contained flat attached to the main house, it seemed like the right move. Theo had just started intermediate school. Pippa had lost her first tooth. I told myself I'd be useful. I told myself grandchildren need their grandparents nearby. What I didn't say, not even to myself, was that I was frightened of dying alone in Blockhouse Bay with the second cup of tea going cold on the bench. So I sold up. Not just the house, everything. The Blockhouse Bay weatherboard went to a young couple from Christchurch who wanted a project. I cleared out Sandra's things, which took me 3 weeks, and a great deal of sitting on the floor of her wardrobe, holding things I had no use for and could not bring myself to throw away. I kept her garden journals. I kept the blue cardigan she wore on Sunday mornings. I sold the furniture, the tools, the good set of Craftsman spanners I'd had since 1987. The proceeds went into what my accountant Douglas called a solid, conservative portfolio. Just over $900,000. Money I intended to leave to Carolyn and the grandchildren. Money that represented the full weight of everything Sandra and I had built together. I moved into the Titirangi flat on a Wednesday in late April. Carolyn made a roast. Dale helped me carry boxes. Theo showed me how to connect the television to something called a streaming service, which took longer than it should have and ended with both of us laughing on the floor. Pippa gave me a drawing she'd made of the 2 of us standing in the bush, which I put on the refrigerator immediately. That first night, listening to the tui in the trees outside and the distant sound of rain on the roof, I thought, this is it. This is the good part. I was wrong, but I didn't know it yet. The first thing I noticed was the mail. Not my mail. I had a separate letterbox on the flat's entrance. A small red one Theo had helped me paint. I mean the mail that arrived at the main house. I wasn't snooping. The letterbox for the main house was at the end of the shared driveway, and I walked past it every morning on my way to check my own. About 3 weeks after I moved in, I noticed that Dale had started collecting the mail himself, even on mornings when he was running late for work, which was most mornings. Before that, Carolyn had always been the one who grabbed it on her way back from dropping the kids at school. But I am a builder. I spent 40 years reading structures, looking at a wall, and knowing what was happening inside it before I opened it up. You learn to pay attention to the small things because in construction, the small things are always telling you something about the large things. The second thing I noticed was the conversations that stopped when I walked into the kitchen. Not abrupt stops. Nothing so obvious. More like a sentence that gets redirected midstream. A topic that suddenly becomes the weather. A look exchanged between Carolyn and Dale that lasted half a second too long before one of them turned to ask me how I'd slept. I told myself I was imagining it. Retirement makes you paranoid, Douglas had warned me. You've got too much time to think. The third thing was the phone call I wasn't supposed to hear. 6 weeks after I moved in, I was in the back garden pulling weeds from around Sandra's rose bush. I'd brought 2 of her roses from Blockhouse Bay and planted them along the flat's western wall, which got the afternoon sun. The bathroom window of the main house was open, and Dale was inside, talking to someone. The bush was quiet that afternoon. One of those still autumn days where sound carries differently, and I heard him say quite clearly, he trusts her completely. That's the whole point. Then a pause. Then, the old man won't ask questions if it comes from Carolyn. I stayed very still among the roses for a long time after that. That evening, Theo found me on the flat's front step as I was watching the last of the light leave the trees. He sat down beside me without being asked. Which he sometimes did. He was that kind of boy. Comfortable with quiet. More like Sandra than anyone in the family. We sat there for a while, and I didn't say anything about what I'd heard. But something must have shown in my face because after a while he looked at me sideways in the way he had and said, "Grandpa, are you okay?" "Just thinking," I said. He nodded. He didn't push it. But before he went back inside, he stopped at the door and said, in a very low voice, "Grandpa, I think you should talk to Uncle Brent. Brent is my son. Carolyn's older brother. He lives in Wellington, runs a small accountancy firm on Lambton Quay. Brent and Carolyn have never been close. There's a particular friction between them that started when Sandra got sick. Something to do with who visited more and who carried more of the weight. I had stayed out of it. Families have their faults, and I'd always believed you don't pull on those threads unless you're prepared for what unravels. But Theo had said it with such careful deliberateness, looking at the floor, the way he did when he was being very serious about something. And Theo was 11 years old and had no reason to say something like that unless he'd seen something or heard something that frightened him. I called Brent the next morning from the flat, with the door locked and the television on low for cover. Brent picked up on the second ring. "Dad, I was wondering when you'd call." That stopped me cold. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've been waiting. Since you moved in." He paused. "Has Dale spoken to you about the portfolio?" "No. Why would he?" Another pause, longer. "Dad." 2 months ago, Dale contacted Douglas. "Your accountant." He introduced himself as your son-in-law and said you'd asked him to start handling some of your financial administration. He said you'd mentioned it to Douglas directly. The trees outside the window were very still. I said no such thing, I said. "I know, Dad. I know." What Brent had discovered, working quietly on his own in Wellington after Carolyn had said something at Christmas that hadn't sat right with him, was this. Dale had spent the past 18 months building a particular kind of architecture, not with timber and nails, with paper. He had positioned himself, gradually and carefully, as the natural financial intermediary between me and my assets. He had cultivated a relationship with Douglas under the pretense of my authorization. He had researched, Brent believed, the process for establishing an enduring power of attorney, And he had been waiting for the right moment, the right frailty, the right opening. He had not yet moved the money, but he had built the door. He had installed the lock. He was waiting for me to hand him the key. Have you ever sat in a quiet room in a house belonging to your own daughter and felt the walls rearrange themselves around you? The flat suddenly felt different. The roast dinners, the helpfulness, Dale carrying my boxes up the driveway, asking about my knee, checking whether I needed anything from the shops, all of it relit from behind by something cold and calculating. And Carolyn, I could not yet answer the question of Carolyn, because there are two possibilities when someone you love is standing next to a person doing something wrong. Either they know and are complicit, or they don't know and have been deceived the same as you. Those two possibilities require completely different responses, and the worst thing you can do is react before you know which one you're dealing with. I stayed calm. This is the thing about being 68 and having buried a wife and built 1,000 walls with your hands. You know that panic is a tool that only works against you. I stayed calm, and I made a plan. The plan had 3 parts. The first part was Brent. I asked him to contact Douglas directly and, without revealing the full situation, to establish clearly on the record that Dale Pemberton had no authority over my financial affairs, had never had authority, and was not to be given any information going forward. Douglas was horrified. He had, it emerged, been very nearly taken in. Dale had been plausible and patient, and had mentioned details about my life that he could only have learned from Carolyn. Douglas flagged the file immediately. The second part was a solicitor. I called Margaret Anaru, who had done Sandra's estate and who I trusted completely. I asked her to help me update my will and to create a very clear, very explicit document establishing that all decisions regarding my estate, my health care, and my financial affairs were to be made jointly by Brent and a professional trustee appointed by Margaret's firm. Not Dale, not Carolyn, not anyone living in that house on the hill in Titirangi. The third part was the hardest part. The third part was waiting to understand Carolyn. It took me another 3 weeks to find out. The way I found out was Pippa. Pippa was 8 years old, and she had the particular superpower of small children who are often overlooked in a household of adults. Managing complicated things, she simply said what she saw. One afternoon, she was sitting on my step while I was making her a Milo, and she said, without looking up from the beetle she was examining on the concrete, "Daddy and Mummy had a big fight last night." "Did they?" I said, carefully. "Daddy was saying Mummy needed to talk to you about something, and Mummy was crying and saying she couldn't." Pippa looked up at me then. She said it wasn't right. She kept saying that. "It's not right, Dale." I set down the Milo very quietly. "Then Daddy got really loud," Pippa said, and said she'd already agreed and she couldn't back out now. I sat down on the step beside her. My chest was doing something complicated. 8 years old. She had brought me the truth in the same matter-of-fact way she'd brought me the drawing for the refrigerator. Children see everything. We spend so much time assuming they don't. I said, "Thank you for telling me, sweetheart," she said. "Is everything going to be okay, Grandpa?" I said, "Yes, I'm going to make sure of it." That evening I called Carolyn and asked her to come to the flat alone. She came at 7:30, after the children were in bed. She sat down across from me at the small table by the window, and she looked terrible, pale, and drawn in the way she'd looked as a teenager when she was carrying something she couldn't put down. She looked like her mother, actually, in that specific way that Sandra had when she was about to say something that cost her. I didn't go after her. I didn't accuse her. I said, "Carolyn, I already know most of it. I don't need a confession. What I need to know is whether you want to get out of this or whether you want to stay in it." She started crying almost immediately. Not the performance of crying, the real thing, ugly and halting, the kind that comes up from somewhere below the chest. She told me that Dale had first raised the idea about 14 months ago. He'd framed it as protecting me, making sure my assets were managed properly, making sure I didn't make a bad decision in my old age. He'd said it was what Carolyn owed me, that it was what a good daughter does. He'd been working on her for over a year before I ever moved in. She hadn't told me he'd contacted Douglas. She'd known and she hadn't told me, and she said this was the thing she could not live with. The thing that woke her at 3 in the morning. The thing that made her feel like a stranger in her own face. I kept thinking I would stop it, she said. I kept thinking I would tell you. And then I didn't. And then it had gone on so long I didn't know how to start. I looked at my daughter for a long time, 68 years old, and I was looking at my daughter the way you look at a building after a structural event, trying to understand what failed and where, and whether what remains is worth saving. Carolyn was worth saving. That much I was sure of. Dale was a different question. What happened next took 6 weeks and involved Margaret Anaru, a barrister she brought in from a firm in the city, and a conversation between Brent and Dale on a Tuesday afternoon in Titirangi that I was not present for, but have been told was brief and entirely unambiguous. By the end of those 6 weeks, Dale understood with precision the legal situation he had constructed for himself. The approach to Douglas alone, the misrepresentation of authorization, was enough to constitute fraud. Margaret had documented everything. Brent had documented everything. Douglas had signed a statutory declaration. Dale did not go to the courthouse. In exchange for that, he agreed to terms. He and Carolyn separated. He left the Titirangi house. He has not, as far as I know, attempted anything like this again, though I have no particular reason to believe that's because he's a changed man. And every reason to believe it's because he knows the file exists and is being held. Carolyn stayed in the house with Theo and Pippa. She went back to the part-time nursing work she'd given up when Pippa was born. She is rebuilding, which is a slow business, the same as any structural repair. Some mornings when I walk up to the main house and she's at the bench making school lunches, she looks up and I see the effort it takes her to hold my gaze. I don't look away. I think that matters. My money is where it should be. It is held in a properly structured trust, administered jointly by Brent and Margaret's firm. When I die, it will go where Sandra and I always intended, to Carolyn and the children, in a form that is protected and accounted for, and cannot be redirected by anyone standing close enough to someone vulnerable to take advantage of the warmth. I am still in the flat in Titirangi. I did not leave, which surprised some people. But this is my family. This is the bush, and the tui, and Pippa's drawing on my refrigerator, and Theo sitting on the step in the early evening without needing to say anything. You don't abandon a building because someone tried to compromise it. You find the fault, and you repair it, and you make sure it's stronger than it was before. Theo never told me exactly what he saw or heard that made him say I should call Brent. I asked him once, gently, and he just shrugged and said, "Dad talks on the phone in the car sometimes when I'm in the back seat. I don't think he remembers I'm there." Out of the mouths of children. The Waitemata doesn't forgive, my father told me. But I've come to think he was talking about paying attention about the cost of ignoring what the water is telling you before it swallows something you can't recover. The harbor isn't cruel. It's just honest. Most of the damage in this world is done not by people who hate you, but by people who love the thing you have more than they love you. They are patient and they are plausible and they understand, with great precision, which doors you have left unlocked. The lesson I carry now is this: love is not a reason to stop paying attention. In fact, love is the very reason you must pay closer attention than anywhere else, because the people closest to you are the ones who know exactly where you keep the key. Your children need to see you standing upright, not hard, not cold, not suspicious of every hand extended toward you, but upright. There is a difference between trust and surrender. And it is one of the most important differences a person can understand before they are too old or too alone or too frightened of the quiet to tell them apart. I am 68 years old. I have 2 roses growing along the western wall of a flat in the Waitakere Ranges, and they bloom every spring. And I think Sandra would have found the whole thing deeply vindicating. She never trusted a house that was trying too hard to impress you. She was right about that. She was right about most things. Pay attention to the children. Listen to what the quiet is telling you. And if someone who loves you starts handling your mail before you've asked them to, put down your cup of tea and ask yourself clearly, and without flinching, exactly what it is they're hoping you won't read.